the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to my friend, David Leskowitz. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
We first met about 10 years ago, and it was during one of my very first times teaching astrology at this anarchist free school in Oakland.
Right on. I was trying to recall the topic of the class. I just remember the tenor of the class. It was very exciting, and we were all very different levels, some professional, some new. Great times. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a romp through the history of astrology.
Yes.
So we went from Mesopotamia to today. But it was super cool to be, meeting you in the context of this pop-up renegade astro class.
Yes, and that was like the second year of my being really into astrology, so it was really awesome to meet someone who is already such a deep scholar of the wide world of astrologies.
Yes. And that brings me to the very first question, though, which is, what was your first meaningful astrology book?
Yeah, well, the first time I read a book that was about astrology was a Vedic astrology book by Bepin Behari. And since I hadn't had any context otherwise, it all was formative imprint. Like, for example, nakshatras, the really profoundly different ways of looking at the stars and working with the energies and meanings that really was imprinted on me from that book. But otherwise, I don't recall a thing. But as I became a true Bay Area astrologer, picking up books at all the used bookstores, I found Rudyard and Noel Tyl and all of those 70s classics. I realized that I had this book by Dane Rudyard already in my collection, but it's about the mysticism of music.
And the title of the book?
The Magic of Tone and the Art of Music by Dane Rudyard.
Wow.
And it was made in a little year we like to call 1982. Which happens to be our shared birth year.
That's true. We are the vintage.
Yes. So I was familiar already with his sort of vast and hard to grasp writing style before. But the interesting thing about this book is that it was an oblique gift from, like, a sideways reception from my eventual astrology mentor, who was a professor of mine at college. And I'd gotten this book that once belonged to him. So it was sort of a seed from the past. Rudyard would love the use of the word seed in conversation.
Yeah. So you have this transmission of lineage that your astrology mentor gave you a book written by Rudyard about Rudyard's musical career.
Right.
His musical philosophy.
And I don't even know that I would have known what an astrologer was had he told me he's also an astrologer.
Oh, at the time that he gave that book to you?
Yeah, I was studying music and ethnomusicology sort of thing, Indian music, so he was the scholar. But yeah, the whole intro to astrology by Noel Tyl, which I don't think anyone reads anymore, was just what was available to me on the shelves of Moe's and other bookstores in Berkeley. So I kind of pieced together a worldview of astrology from that, psychological, humanistic astrology, which was a pretty good place to get my bearings. And as this was the early 2010s, the real renaissance of traditional and Hellenistic astrology was not, at least in my perception, out there. And so in a way that was useful for me as someone whose work is beyond modern astrology. I work with the outer planets and centaurs and asteroids. So in a way, it sort of freed me from having too many frameworks that wouldn't really marry well with those materials anyway. When I started out, I became a free thinker that way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And now you're making, if it's not a modern astrology, what did you say, postmodern? Or what would you call that work with these outer factors and planets, centaurs, all of that?
I used to call that ultramodern astrology as a bit of a joke. And then, I don't know, I think it's just astrology from my point of view. Some astrologers who work with asteroids or centaurs are actually quite traditional in their approach, like Demetra George, and Melanie Reinhardt is herself kind of a traditional astrologer in lots of ways. both of them, of course, were astrologers before the Centaurs were discovered. So that is markedly different from you and I and our 1980s coming through into the world that the Centaurs had just begun to be found by us. So
they had already rooted, like we came into a space of Chiron was always already there, not some new factor.
And so we get to be that generation that has been able to trace their main stakes along the timeline with these planets already in our awareness, which again is a very Rudyardian sort of thought, that these planets, like the outer planets, come through when humanity is ready to work with that archetype. Possibly true.
Very cool. So if I sent you to M87 onto the event horizon of the black hole that was recently photographed by an entire decades-long team of researchers, and I could give you the ability to take some books with you, even though through that kind of gravity you might not be able to lift your hands enough to read them, what would be the books that you would take with you?
Well, I sure would have wished I had Phil Sedgwick's Guide to Black Holes by then, but that's on CD-ROM only. So assuming I couldn't plug anything in M87, I think I'd feel nostalgic for the Earth and some of the cultures of astrology that I'd be leaving behind. So there's a few, that I never really had the time to delve into in our day-to-day here. Stuff like the longer works of Liz Greene. I've never even read her Neptune tome. So if I don't know what happens to time when you're in a black hole, but I imagine it's probably very slow. So I would give that the attention it deserves. I'm a very Piscean and also Neptunian by virtue of it being in my 10th house sort of individual. So I feel like that would be an appropriate time for studying those kind of, ponderous works that also, I don't think I'd have to be casting too many charts out there, So also something like just a book I really wanted to memorize or approach from an overhead point of view. I've always been interested in Indian astrology as well, but something like the Yavana Jataka, which is one of those pivotal works of the cultures that get transmitted from Greece to India and back and forth. So actually, I don't know anything about that particularly, but that's been on my list of when I have the time to study. Oh, and then the third book, yes, is one of my first astrology books called Inside Planets by Ellias Lonsdale. And that's one of those books that you don't really need an ephemeris or a chart to enjoy, because the perspective of this work and all of his series of inside astrology books is that he was channeling them, which one of your previous guests has already mentioned, with his departed beloved. And so they had this inside point of view. They were looking at the consciousness of the planets rather than analyzing them. They were working with them as direct modes of being. And so with Inside Planets, it's always been one of my favorite, just either through bibliomantic divination or just to get in there with someone without having to really analyze a chart. The point of this is that it's the subjectivity of the planet rather than trying to objectively define something. So I happen to know that your work dovetails with Vesta quite a lot, and that as we were born in the same period of 1982, we share Vesta in Aquarius. Is that right?
Yes.
So I thought I could do a little reading here. Vesta in Aquarius, the Lonsdales. Her mental set is raging with an incredible multiplicity of factors to encompass. The most powerful and persistent factors cluster around her tasks and preoccupations. When engaged in pursuing the track of problem solving, or taking care of impossibly complicated and difficult matters, she puts all her expertise into action and generates superb results. However, she turns everything into monumental tasks and impossible challenges, and has no room in her world for anything else. She functions in a vortex of extreme demands, and her approach to these keeps them going. That's part of the delineation, which I find to be very accurate for that little piece of me that is totally Vestal.
Yeah.
She's working in that place for me in my 12th house. How does that land for you?
Totally on. Yeah, that creation of monumental tasks out of small things and taking challenge head on.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Sort of like becoming an astrologer, right? I mean, it's infinitely complex and there's always more to read.
Mm-hmm.
And yet this subjective consciousness of the planet is a beautiful way of engaging with it that I think does speak to Mesopotamian engagements with the moving lights in the sky and feeling what they're trying to say.
Right. I think any way that we return to that communion with the planetary being, whether we call it magic or religion or anything like that, is so what we need right now. And, he calls himself a wizard in a really true tone. And you don't really meet real wizards, I think, who are really walking their path. He's a true Aquarian in the modern sense of the word, and I think another fun story about this book is that same year you and I met, I happened to be dating someone who, unbeknownst to me at the time, was roommates with his daughter. And I only found that out after when she arrived at our house, and I had just got this book and it was sitting on the table just fresh from the delivery. She was like, "Oh, that's my roommate's father."
What?
It's just one of those
my gosh.
Similar path of the planetary gods will find you,
Oh, yeah. And the world gets so small when you really get into the star stuff. But, one thing I know about our Vesta is that it was stationing around that time.
Oh.
Yes. There's a fun resource I have here that really inspires me artistically that I'll share with you, which is Eleanor Bach's Graphic Ephemeris of Sensitive Degrees. And it has on a single page the entire retrogrades and shadows for every celestial factor for a year, including some asteroids that we don't really look at anymore, like a tiny flower here for Flora and something called Iris and Astrea.
Wow.
Chiron's down here, but Vesta's included.
In a folder down here somewhere to the right of me, I have a binder of Eleanor Bach's monthly asteroid newsletters, but I have never seen that book. And yes, her work with sensitive degrees really has inspired my approach to working with centaurs as well, for sure. That is so cool. And a stationary Vesta makes us real stubborn, I guess. Fixed stationary Vestas.
Right, with a big loudspeaker. Ta-da! You get to do Vesta. I didn't even know that about my personal Vesta. I was trying to get into asteroids more as a sort of challenge to the entrenchment of being labeled a traditionalist. I was like, well, let's see some asteroid stuff just to be Walt Whitman. I'm large, I contain multitudes. Do asteroids too, So I started with Vesta and then I just kind of stopped with Vesta.
We all have our patron planet or tutelary deity in the stars, and that's great. You found yours right away.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So say more about your work with the Centaurs and sensitive degrees.
Yes. This is one of those elements that will never cease to be explored. And relating to both Rudyard and Lonsdale, the whole segment of meaning making through symbols in the sky of the Sabian series and many others, that has allowed me, again, in the less objective, more poetic sense, to focus on the transits of the centaurs and asteroids in a series of meaningful events and noticing the patterns they weave, even kind of removed from, first of all, definitely removed from any kind of dignity in the traditional sense. We don't need to even bother with assigning those because there's other ways they make meaning. And when we watch those loop-de-loops, which we're familiar with through like the 8-point star of Venus, but when we watch the much more convoluted machinations of the Centaur asteroids, we get this kind of inscription in the timeline of when they are bringing their meaning and power down to our experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're able to then either trace the sensitive degree through a transit or a natal aspect, resonance, or synastry, we can find when that is elevated in a chart. And then we can also see when we get patterns that would not otherwise be noticeable. For example, even if a degree point in a chart is not in aspect or anywhere seemingly significant, right, in someone's chart, but it becomes prominent. And for me, that is even, I'm not really a mathematical type. So just noticing, oh, that degree symbol sounds familiar, right? Well, this is a good example I once shared with you a long time ago. So, good old Bucky Fuller, right? Buckminster Fuller. He, among many genius inventions, he designed the geodesic dome. I don't even really know why. There's something about the torsion, the balance. There's just something worth designing for him. It was something he needed to produce. And I think it's in the Pleiadian degree series, which is a rechanneling of the Sabian familiar degree series by a genius American astrologer called John Sandbach. More on him later. But so in that series, Buckminster Fuller's moon, Pisces 18, is at a geodesic dome.
That's awesome.
Now, whether that answers your question or not. One of those little woes. Yeah.
Yes, I love that. You can't say it's like bibliomancy, but there is this very spooky magic with the asteroids and how they come up in people's charts. You know, just like, why does an ex-business partner of mine have the asteroid Jennifer conjunct their midheaven?
Oh, yeah. That's, yeah.
You know,
when it becomes real obvious. And then we wonder, you know, I don't really talk in terms of this being a simulation because I feel like the fact that it's not a simulation is what makes it meaningful. But the fact that we're able to find these uncanny corners everywhere. And yeah, if you're interested in that, then it's, I think the asteroids and centaurs multiply that by virtue of their being much quicker for the most part than, well, the asteroids for one. And then the centaurs are faster than the outer planets mostly. So they're bringing in this middle wavelength of timing. So we have more opportunities to find discrete events in their transits. But let's see, we have to return to this question of yours of how the sensitive degrees and the centaurs align. And so I'll bring up another great example. Pholus is the, I think that was the second centaur discovered, or was it Nessus? I think it was the third centaur discovered then after Chiron. One of the very powerful original centaur planets. And his archetype is related to how he was the holder of the cask of ambrosia that was meant for Dionysus. And when the hero who was destined for that cask arrived, then he uncorked it. But then in so doing, the power that it unleashed caused all the centaurs to be frenzied and everyone died. You know, that sort of Pholus story where sudden ecstasy leads to mass something. And so that energy is a very kind of sexual eruption energy, right? Of the champagne cork coming out and all the contents bursting forth. And so one of the crucial Pholus examples came through to me. And this is sort of when a planet shows its meaning to me in action in my education through studying it. I was studying the mystical experiences of basically anyone I could, you know, analyze and see a more or less definitive time for. And the poet Allen Ginsberg had a mystical vision of William Blake, who became his hero, but also more than that, the vision, which was an auditory vision of Blake's voice reading one of his favorite poems, The Sunflower. And that became the voice of God that led him on his journey into the poet that we know of. So it was the powerful event of that moment. Of course, the reason he wrote it down in his journal was he had just been masturbating. And so that's why the Pholus story, sorry to make this episode rated PG-13, but so, so then looking at Pholus in that through the method that I can talk about later, but I always use the Davison chart of a person and an event to find like a sort of composite, which was just sort of something an angel whispered in my ear and I ran with it.
I love that.
Yeah, we can talk about that, but it just sort of brings a hybrid moment into a chart. And of course, the Davison being an actual planetary pattern that existed on this world sphere, right? That it has some more resonance with what we're used to astrology doing. So anyway, in that chart for Ginsburg, Pholus was at, I think that's 13 Capricorn. And then the Pleiadian degree symbol for that degree is a flame talking to a poet.
Wow.
So it's just the transparency between this sort of convoluted way of getting there, but then finding the brilliance of both the planetary symbol and the poetic symbol coalescing. And so that's kind of level 1 and 2 of working with that. But then finally, when I got around to looking at William Blake's chart, that is to the degree his natal Pholus.
It's just stacking all on top of each other at 13 Capricorn.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. And this insight of the application of a Davison chart to a human and an event in their life. It's not that far off from doing a Davison for a human and a human.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about that, we are our parents' transits crystallized in human form.
An ecstatic experience, hopefully, brought into their, exactly.
Well, the birth might not be. I guess that depends.
Well, in the sort of sense of ecstasis of something coming through, but of course not in the emotional side. Yeah. Yeah, looking at, it was sort of a need that I wanted to discover a way of making one chart about a person and an event, where there's just one set of symbols and not always the merging of a transit or progression and a natal. Right.
Because that's a lot of chart wheels to stack up.
Right. And I'm already getting so many layers. I've got some big wheels somewhere over there with, you can align, the solar return, the lunar return, 3 different kinds of progressions, this kind of progression. You can get to some, especially when looking at the key degrees that we're talking about, which can be related to when there's an actual physical loop-de-loop in the sky of a stationing motion, or they can often recapitulate each other too. It can get very much like what you were speaking of in showing the chart from Eleanor of the actual physical slowing down and speeding back up at a particular sensitive degree. They can become sort of the progenitor of that being the sensitive degree that we experience when it happens in whatever kind of timing technique we're working with, if that makes sense.
It's going to take a lot of pause tape, y'all. Rewind, re-listen. That's nesting levels of symbolic complexity, but I guess we put our Vestas to work on that, you and I.
That's right. If you want to pause the tape and play it again with my words and diagrams, I do have a little class available on my website, which we can link to on that DRC method. But anyway.
Yeah, in the show notes, for sure. No, I love that. I love the way your mind thinks, and also this concept of nesting wheels upon wheels upon wheels, and then also parking that to go back to the simplicity of creating a chart for the midpoint in time and space of someone and an event in their life.
You got it.
But the ontology of that moment is questionable.
It's worth questioning.
Okay, I like that revision. It's worth questioning, only because it's like, because you ask yourself, what is the root? Like, the human has a root, the event has a root, but the chart created of the midpoint between those two in time and space.
Well, what it appears to be to me, having worked with this for a while, it's a kind of progression. It's like a half-life progression. So it's rooted in the natal chart because we're cutting it back to the event time and then dividing that exactly in half, as you're saying, it's the midpoint. Mm-hmm. So it is rooted in the natal chart in a way. And then it kind of can convolute into a sort of progression of keeping on going around the spiral.
Yeah. Radioactive half-life synastry.
But thanks for entertaining this kind of gonzo theory. I wouldn't even speak of it unless I hadn't already applied it to hundreds of useful case studies, So
Sure. Yeah, no, and I can see there's a spark inside what you're saying, and I
totally
wish I had another couple lifetimes to do all the things that one can do with astrology, and I hope anyone listening is inspired to also play with this method, because it's completely fascinating.
Thanks. I think to bring it down a level to more sensible, familiar territory, I would also just show this other wonderful series that I happened to encounter early on by the late Robert Blaschke. And so I'm holding up Astrology, A Language of Life, Volume 1, Progressions.
I love his work.
It's like only about 100 pages. And it's so funny that that's the first book in a series of astrology textbooks, right, is progressions that might usually fall once you've gotten the sense of the radical chart and transits, etc. But so this book is very dense, but he goes through secondary progressions, tertiary and minor progressions. And these are things which, sort of a footnote in modern astrology, I think these days, the actual true meaning of what these systems are. But so he brings them into a very sort of spiritual understanding of the layers of our consciousness or life that they're working through. So I have to just kind of flip through it. But what the emotional, physical, and mental reality are what they are logging. And so you might think, why do we need 3 ways of progressing the planets if we're all just trying to find an event, right? If we're trying to tell someone when they're getting the thing. But so if it's also about what the thing will mean for them or where it is in their life purpose, then we can look at these other sort of progressions. And this is one of those alleys through the libraries of astrology that maybe I tiptoe in and then close the door on again because there's so many ways of applying meaning. But whenever I get back to that, I can really mesmerize myself and clients with that. Even if you just sort of know sometimes, right, that one technique is going to be the right thing for that one problem, and you happen to look at minor progressions and it's going to show you exactly what they need to know. So the more we have at our disposal, we're more able to play the right card at the right time.
Yeah, and you're speaking to the concept that we have charts that might not respond in the same ways to all techniques, but that as a person who's adept at reading, you can look at a chart and go, oh, for some reason I feel moved now to see minor progressions here. I don't normally do that, but we're going to do it today.
Mm-hmm.
Or, for example, I had a client, sometimes I call it the red telephone of spirit, but this person was like, I need to talk to you immediately. There's a house on the market. I want to know if I'm going to land it. It's my dream house. I just found it today. We're going to go talk to the realtor tomorrow. So I was like, well, I obviously don't have any time to waste. I need to look right now. Person was born in California, looking on the East Coast. And I was like, what if I relocated the progress chart? And there was a significant lunation exactly partile to their progressed IC.
Excellent.
So I was like, yep, go for it. Put it all in, put all the chips on the table, and they got the house. They're still in it.
Congrats to all.
But I don't normally relocate a progress chart like that. Or relocate a locational situation.
Yes, that's a whole awesome kind of brave frontier of when you've got to do the thing, even though no one said you should do it already. And then you can also apply the same DRC. Relocated Davison charts are incredible as well. You can progress those and see exactly when something's going to happen for 2 people at a certain place. It's all there. And you can cast asteroids on those relocated charts and see, for example, I presently reside at the place where Chiron is trine my midheaven. And that's just like the right place for me to be to delve into working with the Centaurs,
And you recently published an anthology about Chiron, or all Centaurs.
We are about to do so. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Hopefully that will be tangible reality very soon.
We'll have to come back and do a book talk at CAELi about it.
Looking forward to that very much. Thanks.
Very cool. Very cool. So if you were going to kick off a beginner into this fascinating gonzo world of astrology that you are occupying, how would you get someone to get onto your life raft?
I would first say look at the sky to notice the moon, just the lunar cycle, and how that relates to day and night. Because that is like a mystery that I feel like few people could actually define clearly. Just to watch that, observe it. Maybe we have our first month on the raft, just doing that. Kind of the things that are more tangible in the senses and less about thinking, I think are great ways to ground yourself in the reality that astrology is meaningful for us when we're just living our lives. And then especially as my work is about, in a sense, the invisible planets, then we can get far too abstracted from our lives, especially as, I and many others use the tropical zodiac, which is certainly observable in many ways, but you can't just point to the sky and notice where it is, or I can't. Maybe you can with the right tools. But so what I'm saying is that it really helps to have the more obvious observable qualities. Like I'm wanting to say using planetary days and hours is another one of those. And that relates totally to, of course, the tropical zodiac and the Placidus houses, which I use both of those. I think I would have to be more of a wizard to actually be able to teach those on the life raft, without any materials, but that could be a fun way to really ground that. But in terms of books, if we have the library or the iPad that has all the books on it, I'm going to go with, that's sort of more, what's even the word for this when it's not as analytical, but we're in that felt sense of what the astrology means. And that's why I love the Lonsdale work and dealing with degree symbols. So let's pause that also, because in the degree symbol work, although I and someone recently on your series mentioned the work of Lonsdale, he found this through John Sandbeck, who is in that same lineage coming from Rudyard and Mark Edmund Jones of modern humanistic astrology, but he's also purely a medium, and so was able to attune his mind to the same channel that they were working with when Elsie Wheeler and Jones found the Sabians. But then he walked into that same sort of painting and saw in much higher definition and perhaps from a different vantage point. And he called those the Pleiadian degree series. And they're just so much more useful for me as a person in the 21st century working with more interesting happenings. And then likewise, he has this ability to refine other people's work. So Sandbeck has channeled 4 series. 3 of them are from other series. Oh no, only 2 are. Sorry. And then he's got the Chandra symbols, which was his first. And that was directly from an Indian goddess called Chandra, according to him. And that may relate to a certain paradigm that may have existed in India or not. My point in saying this is that when someone works with the degree series and having perhaps 4 of them, which is in Sandbeck's book, The Circular Temple, which is a beautiful figuration of the zodiac around us being a 360-point temple. Even if you just know where the moon is, for example, if you're able to work with the moon, and maybe you can track the ascendant, or you can observe what it means to have the circle of space around you become sensible and that the symbols come through with something, right? So I think that's a great way to especially work with planets whose meaning is not yet so clear to us, like the newer planets, because they can just give you their message directly without having to figure something out.
That's awesome.
But yeah, thanks for asking. I am not yet, due to also there being a paucity of astrology books written on centaurs, that I don't have the stack of centaur books everyone is always asking me for. And that is why we are producing one right now. Though there are some key works such as Chiron and the Healing Journey by Melanie Reinhardt, which I think is basically an evergreen book at this point. She spent many years researching and producing this one for us. There are other books. Adam Gainsbourg's approach is really wonderful for Chiron too. So one of the beautiful things about studying centaurs too is everyone has a completely different understanding of what the centaur means. And so you can't even give a clear delineation of what Chiron through the houses means to everyone. Everyone will have a different approach to that.
You think that's something inherent in Chiron's meaning then, that it is so hard to define?
Yeah, I think it's like a cipher. It's how it's coming through for you at that time from your own perspective. And there's going to be a coherence in the overall theme of what Chiron means to everyone. But it could even be that just our understanding is being refined as we work with it more and more. We can get kind of metaphysical about all that, but it could even just be that it doesn't have one meaning. And like any kind of, what's the word for when it's bibliomancy, but stars? Astromancy, when it's astromantic, we are getting the message at the right time, The
word fugitive is coming to mind. There's something kind of runaway about these centaurs. They're not necessarily going to act. They're not planets, they're
right.
Evasive has the connotation of trickery or some kind of purposefulness, but I don't know, fugitive, they're like on the run. They're just, not to be given rulership or not, they're outside of that entire traditional structure.
I think that's a great image for them having become visitors to us. And then they're certainly going to exit the system at some point in a really small time scale, cosmically speaking. So absolutely, they can't really be pinned down by our ancient models. And we don't have to waste our time trying to do that either.
Yes, exactly. Just enjoy them and talk to them, apparently, right?
Yeah, ask them to speak.
Any other books you'd give to a beginner?
I really feel like I have to mention the work of Stephen Forrest, even though I don't particularly practice in his paradigm anymore. But this very worn copy of Yesterday's Sky, which is his work on karmic astrology, I guess you could say, just shows how much I have absorbed his basic point of view, at least. I used to think it would be really cool to call myself an evolutionary astrologer because that's how it was presented to me as someone who is going to work with a soul and its journey. You know, I really do like the work of Jeff Green as well in that regard. But of course, these were all written before the Centaur age in a certain way really came through. And so it became a little less necessary for me to apply other paradigms for these new planets, right? But as the pioneers of working in a really meaningful way with the outer planets, especially Pluto, of course, it's always showing a certain guideline for how we're going to allow the new planets to have their own sort of power and sovereignty in their own sphere, you know, so we can apply that from any layer of the cosmos, I think. And I guess the last plug for the Centaurs is that they're the ones who help us really understand the outer planets, because the outer planets are such impersonal vastnesses, and the Centaurs being somewhat Saturnian, somewhat Uranian, you know, we can work with that middle wavelength in a more sane and grounded way. So that's why I sure love Centaurs, and they can be the key, but also just a friendly team of explaining powers, you know, that they get in there between the totally inscrutable and the more understandable. And so one of the great things to work with is when you already have a solid basis in whatever your perspective framework for your inner planets, and then you look to the outer planets from the point of view of the Centaurs. That can be really useful.
Wow. Thank you for bringing all of these amazing thought forms onto the show. And where can people find you?
Great. I'm at centaurs.space.
That's a brilliant URL. I love it.
We're glad to have those later domains. And we also have centaurhealing.earth for the opposite side of working with the more magical and embodied working with the planets.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.